Today I'd like to talk to you a little bit about the rock hard 4x4 skid plate system that we offer. Now, the skid plates that are laying out here for a 4-door skid plate, the only difference between a 4-door and a 2-door is in our fuel tank skid here, and it's just a little bit shorter to accommodate for the shortness of wheelbase in the 2-door. Here is our oil pan skid. All of our newer design oil pans skids have a square cut out here, and this is a trapdoor system, so it makes it easier access for you to drain the oil on your Jeep. The other thing that's nice about it is it takes the same skid plate for the 2007 through 2011 with the earlier motor and the 2012 on up to with the newer motor. This is shown here in a standard configuration. We also make a long arm oil pan skid for the people that have long arm suspension. The difference is this area right here is trimmed off of the skid to accommodate for a short arm and a long arm, okay? So if you have a short arm skid right now and you decide to upgrade your suspension later on, you're just simply going to be trimming it. If you've went through and looked at what it takes to install a long arm suspension, trimming the oil pan skid is very minor. This here's our transfer case skid. Now, the particular one we're showing here today is in aluminum. We also build that in steel. It looks identical. The only difference is you're not going to see those 4 bolts on your steel one. This is a steel brace that we've put on an aluminum pan skid, and you can't weld steel to aluminum. Therefore, we've bolted the cross member brace to the transfer case skid. On the steel version, that's welded. Now, the reason we've put steel bracing with our aluminum skids is just to get extra strength in it. Fuel tank skid is going to bolt on to the factory holes also, so all the skids bolt onto the all factory holes. Now, with the fuel tank skid, we've made an area for 3 additional bolts that can be added, and we recommend it, but it does require a slight bit of drilling to add those 3 holes. Now, we do have some people that install them without doing it, but you know what? Drilling a hole is really minor. Go ahead and put those in. Sometimes we get a few questions of what this piece is here. This is a shim, okay? What this shim is, it goes across the cross member. And that cross member is where the exhaust crosses over from right-hand side to left-hand side in your vehicle. Now, most of the time that exhaust is higher than the cross member, so it's not a factor. We have had sometimes where customers are in need of that shim because their exhaust hangs slightly lower than that cross member. And what we do is we don't want to have any rattles because our system mounts to the frame of the vehicle, not to your engine and not to your engine. We don't want to mount to the engine. That's where you're going to end up with a vibration, and we don't want that. So sometimes where the exhaust crosses over, that shim may be needed to slightly space that oil pan and or transfer case skid down a little bit for clearance on your exhaust. And the way the skids are designed is the cross member of your Jeep is right here, okay? And we go through that cross member in 4 different areas. And on the bottom side, we're going to put what we call our rock dome washers or skid plate washers. And what these are is the head of the bolts are going to go in here, and this is going to be tapered here, so you're not going to be tearing up the heads of the bolts. Also makes it so you'll be able to remove your skids later on for some reason you ever have to work on your transfer case or transmission. The fuel tank canister skid is an Evap canister that sits in front of the left-hand wheel, the passenger side rear, and what it does is it's basically a fuel tank breather system. It vents the fuel tank. Now, on the 2012 through newer Jeeps, there is a slight skid on, it's a thin skid, where ours is built out of 3/16 in steel and 1/4 inch aluminum. Now, something that confuses people is you do need to remove that factory hanger skid on the 2012 on up ones to install ours. The same part number will work on the 2007 all the way to the brand new ones. Okay, now we're going to go ahead and turn these skid plates over. We're going to show you the skid surface. Now we're showing what the skid plates look as if you're looking from the bottom side up. So this is the surfaces that you're going to be skidding over. And you can notice how everything is fairly flat and contoured. You'll notice that we have our rock dome washers here that protect the heads of the bolts along with the one at the opening of the oil pan. Now the one in the oil pan does get down a little bit, but it's in an area that you're normally not going to be hit it. Right in here in the center is where normally most people are hitting things when they're out off-roading. This is a fuel tank skid. Now if you're on a 4-door JK, the fuel tank skid is probably the first skid you should be putting on, because I know that sounds odd. Most people are thinking it's the oil pan. But if you'll find that you'll look underneath your Jeep after you've been doing a little off-roading, the skid plate is, the fuel tank is actually where you're hitting it the most. And the reason that is because of the long wheelbase and when you start coming over things. So we always recommend that you start with the fuel tank skid plate and a canister skid plate, oil pan, and then your transfer case skid plate. Once again, here's the shim that you may need if you have your exhaust crossover is lower or if you've installed exhaust spacers. These skid plates are easy to install, and we're going to show you how to do that. Okay, now we're going to go ahead and look at what we need to do to install the transfer case and the oil pan skid. Now, on the Rubicon models and some of the other ones, there's this cross member right here. And what it is, it's just a small brace that they put to somewhat protect the oil pan of the motor. But we're going to go ahead and remove this, and we're going to go ahead and remove this factory transfer case skid. Now, if you are using just our oil pan skid, you can use the factory transfer case skid also. But what you're going to find when you see the differences between this and our transfer case skid, you're going to want to head and put the rock hard 4x4 skid on. Now, we're using an 18mm socket. We're going to remove the bolts here, 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 and on that edge of the frame, and the two back here. We're going to go ahead and start doing that now. Don't get me wrong, for ease of convenience, we could have put this on a lift. But we want you to know at Rock Hard 4x4, the components that we make can be installed in your home garage. We will not be reusing this factory cross member or factory oil pan skid that they installed here. Ours is much more stronger and will give you the protection that you need. When you drop this transfer case skid, it's kind of good to put a shoulder underneath of it or a stand or something to keep it from falling down. We're just going to go ahead and drop this out of the way. Another thing is, because we are installing our Rock Hard 4x4 oil pan and transfer case skid, we're not going to be reusing this skid either. Okay, now we're going to install the transfer case skid first. We always start from the back of the vehicle forward when we're doing this. You're going to have a long bolt here, and that's threaded all the way, and it's black, and a shorter one here that's threaded. Now both these are a metric thread because they're going into the factory holes in the frame. We're going to be installing the cross member tube right here on the frame on this side with the longer bolt. We're going to install on this side in the fuel, right by the fuel tank here in this hole. Each of them have a washer on them, and we're going to go ahead and do that now. Now we're going to use a 3/4 inch socket on a 3/8 drive ratchet and tighten this down. In the cross member here, we're going to have 4 bolts that go up into the cross member. Now, since we're putting the oil pan skid over top of this so that we don't have the lip here to catch when you're wheeling. If your exhaust is hanging lower, sometimes we need to include this shim. We'll cover that in a few minutes also. If you've buttoned it up at the cross member, a lot of people have noticed that this hangs down on the left-hand side of the driver's side of the vehicle. That is why this bolt is a longer bolt and it's threaded. And the reason that is it would actually take less than a 1/2 degree of bend in the center of this plate to bring this up straight. But that's why we've included this longer bolt. We want you to just go ahead and bolt that up, and that'll pull that straight with the cross member. Now, normally we're going to go ahead and install the 4 bolts and go up from the cross member, but since we're going to be installing the oil pan skid, we're not going to be putting these 4 bolts in yet. We're going to go ahead and put the oil pan skid over top of this. So first of all, to install the oil pan skid, we're going to line up our hardware. We're going to put the bolts from the motor mount bracket of the frame down, and we're going to install those brackets now. So we'll be showing that here. Now we're going to talk about the hardware real quick. You're going to want to locate the 4 bolts. These are the coarse threaded bolts, and the 4 locking nuts that thread onto them. This is the driver's side bracket, and this is the passenger side bracket. In the motor mount on the frame, which we're going to show a picture of here, there's a slot, and what on the passenger side we're going to use the forward side slot, and on the driver's side we're going to use the rear. So what we want to do is, I normally will drop the bolts from the top going down. So if you hold them at an angle, drop them in the slot, and then we're going to connect the bracket to it. Okay, we're going to take the bolt, hold it sideways, and drop it down in place. Next, we're going to take the bracket and bolt it onto the here. Then we're going to go ahead and install the nut on that. I recommend that we leave everything loose until everything's in place, and then we go ahead and tighten everything up. Now, we're going to go ahead and do the driver's side. Now, on the passenger side, the forward hole, and on the driver's side, we're going to use the back hole. Driver's side here, we're going to go ahead and drop the bolt in this way. Now we're going to go ahead and connect the bracket to this. Okay, if you're looking at this bracket, there's a long side and a short side. Short side goes up, connect it to your bolt, and put the locking nut on it. This will allow for the mounting here of the oil pan skid in the front. Okay, now that we've got our brackets hanging down here and they're loose yet, we're going to go ahead and bring the front of the oil pan skid up, and I always start with the driver's side bolt. This is the easiest one to get in. We're going to put the bolt through the skid plate into the bracket. That'll hold the front of the oil pan skid up. Then we'll go ahead and install the passenger side. And now, another thing is, sometimes it's a lot easier to put it under a floor jack, raise it up in place, and bolt it in place. We want to go ahead and make sure our bolts are lined up. We're going to take a punch, make sure they're lined up, which they do. You're going to use a rock dome washer with one of the fine thread metric bolts. You're going to go ahead and start this in. Okay, now these holes and this one all take the standard metric bolts. Now on the fourth one over here, the fourth one, there's no nut inside the actual factory cross member. So what we're going to do is we're going to use a longer bolt, we're going to use a washer, and then a lock washer, and then a nut on the top side to tighten it down. The reason this is slotted, and these are solid and that one's slotted, is there's some different cross members out there. Our skid will fit with the aftermarket cross members. Now, not all manufacturers are using the same threads as what the factory did, which is the hardware that our skid plates come with. We send the hardware for a factory cross member. Sometimes, because you have an aftermarket cross member, you may need to go get a different thread of bolt. Next, we're going to go ahead and put this in. It does require reaching across from the back side here. We're going to go ahead and install this with a nut and washer on the top side. Now, we want to go ahead and tighten the rest of the bolts up in the front. Now, sometimes, if you have different suspensions, you can put the brackets on the outside of the skid plate. That'll shift the skid plate to the passenger side a little bit if you need clearance for your suspension. If you'll notice, the Rockhard 4x4 skid plate has clearance enough for your drive lines, even if you're running aftermarket drive lines or even aftermarket differentials. It clears the transmission lines on this side of the transmission, has clearance around the motor. If you have put an aftermarket engine in your Jeep, say it's at a Hemi conversion, Rockhard 4x4 offers a different bracket kit available for the Hemi conversion Jeeps. Now we're going to go ahead and check for something. This is a shim, and this shim is designed to have the same bolt pattern as the cross member. Okay? Now, some people's exhaust hangs lower than others. If it does, it will touch this skid plate. Okay? In all the oil pan skids with Rockhard 4x4 is this extra shim. This particular Jeep has almost a quarter of an inch of clearance between the exhaust and the oil pan skid. But just in case you've installed exhaust spacers or have something funky going on with your exhaust, we've provided a shim for it. Now, it's very, very, very rare that you need an extra shim. If you do, please call us, send us an email, we'll be glad to help you out for it. Now we're going to go ahead and install this piece. Now, what we call this piece is we call it a catalytic converter shield. Now, as you know, on the 2012 and 2015 Jeeps, or 2012 and newer, that the catalytic converters are actually right off the top of the motor. They're not down below here like they are on the earlier Jeeps. But we've provided this here for extra support onto the oil pan skid. Now, you'll also see this exhaust loop. Now, this exhaust loop is on the 2012 and newer Jeeps. This exhaust loop is something we don't fully cover. And the reason is because it creates a lot of heat in the exhaust. If you've known that Chrysler has already had some issues with debris and stuff getting in here, that's why this portion of the skid is removable. That way you can get in there. If you've been out in the brush, you can get in there to make sure that you don't have any debris in there. if your exhaust is hanging lower and you need to shim this down, what I recommend doing with this shim is putting it in between the oil pan skid or the transfer case skid and this cross member. Put it right up against that cross member. The nice thing also about rock hard 4x4 skid plates is they brace this cross member, make it extremely strong. Makes it so that you don't necessarily have to put an aftermarket cross member in your Jeep. Now we've got the hardware here for this. You got Allen head bolts and you got nuts. The nuts go on the top side of this plate and the Allen head bolts go on the bottom, so in case you were to hit them. The other thing is you're going to use is one of the metric bolts that are going to go right into the frame. We're going to use a 3/4 inch end wrench for this, a 9/16 end wrench here, and an Allen wrench. Okay, now we're going to go ahead and take a 7/32 Allen wrench and a 9/16 wrench and go ahead and tighten the bolts on this skid plate. Now that those two are tightened down, we have one more left. Find our 3/4 socket here. Okay, we'll go ahead and tighten this one up here against the frame. Now we're going to go ahead and install our rock hard 4x4 skid plate. Now we're installing this on a 4-door. The instructions are pretty much still the same as far as a 2-door. What we're going to have is we're going to have the 2 bolts in the front. These are with our tapered washers. This eliminates the grinding off the heads of the bolts. You're going to have this little plate here with these 2 bolts. What that is for is it goes in between our transfer case skid on the rock hard 4x4 transfer case skid and the fuel tank skid. And that'll be done right here in this little hole here. Now we're going to go ahead and remove the factory bolts that hold the fuel tank in place. Now we're not dropping the tank down, so you don't have to worry about it falling on you. We're going to go ahead and remove the bolt where it meets our cross member for our transfer case skid. We're going to remove the 2 bolts here in the front and the 3 and the 2 going down the side here. These are going to be done with an 18mm socket on the factory ones, and since we've already got our rock hard 4x4 transfer case installed, we're going to use an 3/4 inch socket here. Now, something to keep in mind, some of you guys that have already been out wheeling that have really beat up your fuel tank skid or on the factory Rubicons and Jeeps, if you need to, you can remove the fuel tank and the skid, lay it down, flatten it, and then put our skid over top of it. We don't replace this because this is actually the hanger of the fuel tank. You don't want to replace it as you're opening yourself up to a liability issue if and ever there was your vehicle involved in an accident. Now that we've removed the factory bolts, the ones on the side and the 2 in the front, and the one at the cross member, we're going to go ahead and take our fuel tank skid, hold it up in place. And I'm going to put a jack underneath of it to hold it up in place, make it a little easier for this next bit of the install. Now, sometimes it's necessary to use a punch to line up things. Just as things maybe got a little tweaked while you're off-roading, go ahead and pull it over where needed and go ahead and get the bolts started. What we're going to do is we're going to put a bolt here where it goes to the cross member going over. We're going to go ahead and put the 2 bolts here where they go into the frame with the rock washers on it, and the 2 factory bolts going down the side. Now we're going to go ahead and use the 18mm, tighten up the factory bolts that we use to hold the skid up in place, and a 3/4 inch to tighten the others back up in place. Next, we're going to go ahead and install this plate. Now, this goes on the top side with these button head Allen bolts. So you're going to go ahead and put the bolts up through. Put the plate on the top side with a nut. And a washer. Now we'll go ahead and tighten those up. Okay, now we're going to use a 3/16 Allen and a 1/2 inch inch on the top. We're going to go ahead and tighten these bolts down here. Next, we're going to go ahead and drill the 3 additional bolt holes that we've provided with the Rockhard 4x4 skid. The bolt holes are already in the skid. All you're drilling is through the factory little bit of a skid plate that they call a skid, or the fuel tank hanger. On a 4-door, there's one here, and one on the other side. Now the back side does removal of the rear tire is needed to do it. On a 2-door, there's only 2 additional holes that you need to drill. Next, we're going to go ahead and use the bolts that are provided with the nuts. Now, it's kind of hard to drop the nut down inside here. What I do is I'm actually going to take a piece of tape and tape the nut inside of an end wrench. This will allow me to hold it in place while we start the bolt from the outside. Once it's started, go ahead and take the bolt off, the wrench off, and go ahead and tighten down in place. One thing to keep in mind is we went ahead and put a floor jack underneath here just to make sure that the back of the fuel tank skid was against the fuel tank. We want to make sure it's all the way up. Now, another important reminder is some people that are running Dana 60s or Dana 70s in the rear end that are running a little bit wider yoke on the drive shaft here, we have had once in a while customers had to do a little bit of trimming here, but the only thing you got to remember is if you trim it, you are exposing your fuel tank. Now we're going to go ahead and use a 16mm socket and remove the 2 bolts in the front and the one in the rear that holds this factory little cover in place. We'll also require a 13mm to remove this bolt here that holds the canister to the little cover. Then we will install our Rockhard 4x4 solid skid. Now, I want to show a little bit of a trick here. What we're going to do is we're going to take a pair of tin snips. We're going to cut the factory little shield here. This will make it a lot easier to install. As you can see, we've already started to cut it here. We're going to go ahead and finish that cut over so that we can remove this factory little skid without having to disconnect our lines. You can also cut it with a hacksaw, or you can disconnect the lines and go ahead and remove it. We'll just bend that out of the way. It's really lightweight. And now we'll go ahead and take a 13 and remove this bolt here that holds the canister to this little shield. There is a nut on the top side. Now that we've removed that bolt, the canister will be able to come out of this factory little shield. And if I go ahead and grab it here like this, I can just tweak it. It's very easy, lightweight. As you can tell here, there's not a lot of strength in this factory little skid, and it wouldn't take much of a rock at all to bend it or tweak it. So we could just bend it that easy. Okay? Now, next, we're going to take the Rockhard 4x4 skid and put it up in place. We'll bolt the canister to it through this little hole here in the center, and then we'll go ahead and bolt it up in place to the frame. Now that we've set the fuel tank canister skid in place and went ahead and pushed the plastic into the canister holder, we're going to go ahead and hold it up in place and start the bolts into the frame. This will hold it in place while we go ahead and finish getting everything else aligned. Now we'll go ahead and install the factory nut back on the top side. Using your 13mm wrench, go ahead and retighten this bolt. Now using your 16mm, because we are using factory hardware, go ahead and retighten the 3 bolts that hold the skid to the frame. Now you have completed the installation of your rock hard 4x4 fuel tank canister skid. A couple of the nice things about this skid is in aluminum it's made of 1/4" aluminum, and in steel it's made of 3/16 steel. Now there's a couple things that we've done here. Now some might ask, why did we box the sides of this skid? The reason is it'll actually hold heat in. Okay, we've done some studies with some temperature guns, and when this fuel tank canister gets heat into it and builds a lot of heat, it can actually kick a code on your computer. So Rock Hard 4x4 has opted to leave the sides of this open so that it can vent and cool.